Hello and welcome to Life Beyond the Numbers, the podcast for those curious about creating a more fulfilling work life. Every business boils down to two basics, people and money. Here we focus on the human side. Numbers matter, but people matter most, and people drive performance. I'm Susanne, your host, a coach, consultant, facilitator, and author of Leading Beyond the Numbers. It brings me joy to speak to people and explore together how, although we share many similarities as humans, each of us navigates the world through our own unique lens. This adds intricacy to our interactions and contributes to both the depth and difficulties of interpersonal relationships. Join us for stories, strategies, and insights to help you lead your life beyond the numbers. Well, today the three of us are back together again. There's Dr. Susanne Evans, David Lee, and myself. And this is a fairly irregular get-together, but it's always worth it. And today we are going to be talking about bad behaviours in the workplace and what we can do when they arise. And on LinkedIn, we did a call out asking for some stories, and I know we gathered some, and of course we have plenty of our own in case we run out of those. So who's going to kick us off with a story?
Do you want me to start? Because I seem to know lots of people who've had lots of bad behaviours at work, not them, the stuff that's happened to them at work. So what I will say is I got lots of direct messages on LinkedIn with stories. But what I found interesting is the bulk of people who sent them to me wanted to remain anonymous, but also wanted the story to be anonymous, which I think is interesting in itself. That tells us something, doesn't it, about how this sort of behaviour can impact on people. So I'll give you a few examples plucked out at random from some of these stories, and hopefully they will be general enough so that I'm not identifying the organisation, but interesting nevertheless. So the first one that somebody told me was about a senior person in an organisation that they worked in who was very derogatory to less senior members of staff. So calling them names like junior and things like that, which in itself is pretty bad. But also this person threw food at employees whilst they were speaking to their customers. So whilst this senior person was speaking to their employees, they would punctuate their points by throwing biscuits at the person's head while they were speaking. Let's unpick that one first, shall we? Because I've chosen that one first because it's so terrible that I thought that's probably one of the worst things I've ever heard. I don't know what I mean. It's unbelievable, isn't it?
Well, so here's what comes up. This is sort of asking, maybe it's just a rhetorical question, but it'd be interesting to hear our different theories. It's like, what would make somebody think that was acceptable?
Yeah, and the question that I thought when I read the story, but was exactly that, but also, how does this person behave outside of the workplace? So are they like this at home, or is this something different? Because if this was at home, that you would have real questions about this person and their behavior, and that it's violence, it's abuse, isn't it? And so when they're in the workplace, is that the same? Are they the same at home or in the workplace, or is this something different? And if it's something different, exactly as you said, David, and what happens to somebody that they think this is okay? I don't know the answer, because I mean, it would never occur to me to behave like that. But clearly, in this person's mind, this was a way to behave in the workplace.
Besides kind of the obvious that they haven't been called out or held accountable, one of the things that just popped into my mind that I found so fascinating. Have either of you read any of Bob Sutton's books or listened to him speak? So Robert Sutton goes by Bob. He's a Stanford professor. He was the author of, excuse the language, the book called The No Asshole Rule. And I, so back in the early 2000s, he maybe still does. He had a blog where he would write about research on the corrosive effects of power and including ridiculous, undeserved power. So, for instance, check this out. One of the studies that he talked about was there would be two subjects in an experiment. So let's say Susan and Suzanne, you are told by the researcher, you're going to be attorneys arguing a case. And I'm told, okay, David, you are the judge and you have to judge which person argues better. And that's what we think is the experiment. So you do your thing, I judge. But then the real experiment happens. When it's over, they bring us in a plate of 4 cookies. And the person who just randomly gets selected the judge is way more likely to go for the 4th cookie and also talk with their mouth full of cookie and crumbs spilling out. So that's just one of many examples that he cites about, again, the corrosive effect of power. So, that I think no matter how, self-aware we think we are and like, I want to do the right thing, I think it's so important to be super vigilant the more power that we have. Isn't that wild? Is that
That is, I've never heard of that before. When you were talking, I was thinking about the Milgram experiment with the electric shocks. It was a horrible experiment that actually that is not really talked about that much anymore because it was not very ethical. But that one, how fascinating! And just being put in that position of power immediately changes behaviour. Because I must admit, when I was gathering these stories from people, there's that's the undercurrent. It's someone with power behaving badly towards someone without power. That seems to be the overarching theme, I think. And yeah, maybe that's got the thing. But the other thing that you said, which I think is really important, is not being held to account. So why has no one done anything about this sort of behaviour? Was it something that this person saw their boss do and then they thought it was okay? Because I hear that a lot with stories around long working hours and things. So, oh, well, I had to do it when I started working in banking, consulting, legal, whatever, so everyone else should do the same. So maybe it becomes this sort of perpetuated way of behaving.
Possibly. And it's also that it may have happened at home or at school, and then almost like that person, when they get into a position of power or control, that's the conditioned view they have of how that type of person behaves. And maybe the first time they do it, they're not conscious that they've actually chosen to pick up food and throw it at somebody, because like, really? However, then they kind of thought, oh, well, I got away with it. And they continue. But none of us are psychiatrists or whatever here. So it's all just speculation. But I guess unless you call out bad behavior, it's going to continue. And especially if the person is in the position of power. And I don't know what you do in that instant. It reminds me of our recent conversation, David, about psychological safety, because if you don't feel like you can safely stand up and say something, you may well be ridiculed as well for drawing attention. Hopefully you've got a HR department. I actually, you know what? I think now you take out your phone and you video it. I think that is the way to deal with a lot of this stuff now, that actually it kind of gives a little bit more power to the powerless, because what are they going to do then? And if they watch themselves throw food at somebody, it may well be the trigger that's needed to hold them to account somehow. And just on the power and the corrosive effects of power, I mean, a phrase or saying I've always thought about is power corrupts. and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we don't have to go far to see that playing out in the world.
Absolutely.
No, and I wonder as well whether behaviour that is at that real extreme end of the spectrum, some people might view that and think it's funny. Other people in the office could laugh because it's not happening to them, so they're okay. But that might be something quite amusing for some. And that maybe it's, and maybe even the person it happened to, if they told the story to their friends or family further down the line, they might laugh at it too with the benefit of hindsight. But it's not funny. It's very extreme. And I think actually you're right. This story I think was from some time ago, and you'd like to think perhaps the world has moved on and that that would happen less. I think the bit that's interesting is thinking about bad behavior that's at almost the other end of the spectrum, where it's not that physical, but it's almost more mental, psychological bad behavior that happens in the workplace that perhaps is less obvious but probably more insidious, I would think.
Because it's easier to deny the, oh, I was just kidding. Can't you
Yeah.
take a joke?
Yeah, so I've got an example as well that somebody told me about that, where he was in a meeting with a whole load of colleagues, and they were doing a review of the year and how things had gone. And one particular member of the team was congratulated on a really great piece of work that they'd done, and they were given a bottle of champagne, and everyone gave them a round of applause, and it was all very celebratory. And when they'd sat down again, the boss of this team stood up and basically said, I quote, "You'll be nothing without me," and basically took the credit for all of this work. So the celebratory nature was immediately gone, and the meeting descended into this awful sort of bun fight of accusations. And then they all left, and then apologetic emails were sent, but not from the senior person, who eventually did apologize a few days later. But the quote that my colleague used to describe this person who'd taken the credit for everyone else's work was that they cast an egotistical shadow over the team, which I thought was a really interesting way of putting it. So to me, that's pretty much as bad as throwing something at somebody, because it's taking something away from somebody, taking credit for their work and not allowing them to celebrate. I wonder if that sort of behavior happens more often than we might like to think. I clearly know lots of people who've worked in some really terrible organizations.
I've seen plenty of examples of this myself, Susanne, for sure, in different guises, but in people taking credit where really the credit does not lie with them at all. And I suppose, again, you think like, what is going through their heads? And I guess they're just lacking in confidence, or there's something that they're lashing out. Look at me, I'm great. Why isn't anyone thanking me? We could give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they did have something there and no one mentioned them, and so they lashed out. But it's possible that they just don't cope well when the spotlight's not on them, and that's why they're in a position of leadership, basically, because they want the spotlight and the glory and all that goes with it. Not a lot you can do about that. Again, it's about self-awareness. Now, they did apologize, you said. It'd be great to know if that apology was heartfelt or coerced. Because if it was something that they were made to do, then I guess they never really understood why or felt actually genuinely sorry.
Yeah, from the story that was told to me, it was everyone else in the room apologized immediately for something that they hadn't started necessarily, but it definitely seemed to lead them down a road where the nice atmosphere was lost. The person who I guess you'd think was the protagonist, it seems like didn't apologize until quite a few days later. So you sort of think they were forced to do it, perhaps because of everything else that had gone on. But yeah, it'd be interesting to know whether they truly knew what had happened, what had gone wrong, or whether they were just apologizing because everyone else had apologized. Who knows?
Here's what I'm wondering. So I'm thinking from the listener's point of view in terms of actionable suggestions. The two that I can think of, two domains related to people behaving badly. So one is, what are things that we can do in that situation, both to potentially stop it or mitigate the damage, number one. And then, just as important, what can we do to make sure we're not that guy, so to speak? And I doubt anybody who would bother to listen to this is not prone to throwing, food at people. But again, because we're all imperfect, if we have any kind of power, including even just like having a strong personality, that we can be doing, like there can be people emailing other people about things we've done for other podcasts. So
I hope not.
There's several podcasts dealing with this.
Even as we speak. So I'm curious, like, where would you like to go with those?
Let's do the first one first. So if you're in this situation and you're observing this, or it's happening to you or to somebody around you, how do you stop this sort of behavior? What are the actions that you can take? Let's do that first, and then let's do the self-awareness after, because I think that's really interesting.
So how would you stop it? I think the first thing is you have to weigh up the interpersonal risks involved in the course of action that you take. And I would say that don't do anything that puts you more in the firing line. So don't do anything that's going to get you food thrown at you nonstop all day long, every day. Find someone to talk to, someone to witness it, a couple of people to witness it, take a video of when it's happening. There's a customer there, you said. Can you encourage your customer to make a complaint? There are various ways of bringing it out into the open. If you feel safe enough, you could just say stop. Or please don't do that. Don't throw food at me. I think sometimes if we're very direct in a calm manner, that can hit home quite well. Or I noticed that you threw food at me. I mean, this sounds a bit funny, but I've noticed you're throwing food at me. Do you think that that is acceptable behavior? I mean, you can come up with a couple of variations, but I often think the direct approach to something that is abominable, I can't even say the word, but unacceptable in every domain might actually be the shock that's required, because there's a possibility that the person is not fully aware of the course of action that they've taken.
Yeah, they've done it so long, they're just on autopilot. I can give you two examples. One is like an example of the shock approach, and then I can give a personal example, which was a delayed response that hopefully people will find useful. So one was a young woman who was a career coaching client of mine, and we were doing a mock interview, and the question was like, can you give me an example of how you've dealt with a difficult person? And she said how she was in a meeting with a really important client of the company's. It was like a family-owned business, and there was the patriarch and then the son. And the patriarch was used to bullying people and getting away with yelling and temper tantruming, et cetera. And he did that to her. And kind of to your point, Susan, very calmly, she just said, something like, it's not okay with me that you're yelling at me. When you're able to calm down, I'm happy to continue the conversation. And she gets up and walks out. And he's like, he couldn't believe it. And the son comes running out. He goes, I am so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll keep my father under control. And she comes back in and he's well behaved. So great example of what you're saying, Susan. The personal example, this will sound familiar because it's the story I tell in my book, Dealing with a Difficult Coworker. And so a coworker who when I worked at this company, every now and then in team meetings, so he was the same level as me, in team meetings, he would come out with these off the wall, rude, inappropriate remarks to people, like something maturity level of a middle school or primary school, I think you call it in England, a boy. And I remember I'd be like, what? And then I'd look at the other person to see how they'd respond. And like, is this normal? Because I'd never worked in a corporate environment before. And they looked just as shocked as I felt. Well, a couple of months into working there, being Mr. Introvert, I finally get up my courage to say something in a team meeting. And it was a brainstorming about something. So I share my idea. He looks at me and he goes, your idea stinks, and so do you.
Oh,
I know. Like, what? Like, what do you say to that? And so I had no idea what to say, what do you say to that? So I don't say anything because nothing comes to mind. But of course, hour after hour post meeting, I'm just playing it over and over again, getting angry and angrier and full of self-righteous outrage and how dare he. And then I start plotting my revenge. How am I going to get back at him, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll cut to the chase of, well, actually, before I say about the conversation, I did some serious debating on, do I even bring it up to him? I knew for my psyche, I wasn't willing to let it go. I needed to address it. That's not something I'm willing to tolerate. But given what I'd seen with him before, this really immature boy maturity level, I'm thinking, what are the odds of this conversation going well? I could totally see him just blowing me off, like lighten up, I'm just joking. So what happens if he does that? Now what? So I really debated a lot on whether to even have the conversation, but it's like, no, I need to have it. And so the next day, after hours of obsessing and reality testing with a particular friend of mine, like, what about if I bring it up this way? So check this out. So the next day at work, this was a cubicle environment. So he's at his cubicle and there aren't too many people around yet because it's first thing in the morning. But the last thing I wanted to do was have this discussion with an audience. Did you ever see Gladiator?
yes.
So do you remember when the gladiators, they look at the emperor and they go, we who are about to die salute you. I feel like that would be me to the audience because I know if it becomes a verbal battle, I'm losing. You know? So I asked him like if we could meet in an office. I wanted to talk with him about something. Like, sure. So we get in there. So it's not a spectator event. And I say something like, hey, I don't know if you remember in yesterday's meeting when I brought up my idea and you said your idea stinks and so do you. I'm sure you're just trying to be funny, but being on the receiving end of it, it didn't feel that funny. So I was wondering like, what was up with that? And I was really conscious of no attitude in the voice tone. Is like soft, genuine curiosity. And he's like, oh, wow. I don't even remember saying that. Thank you for letting me know. And I'm like, oh, I didn't expect that. And then he goes, yeah, man, thank you for bringing it up. I would hate to think I was offending people. And of course, I know, Susan, my inside voice, like, you're kidding, right? And then if that's not like gobsmack worthy, he's like, yeah, thank you for telling me, because I really pride myself on my professionalism. I know, I'm like, you're kidding, right? No, I didn't say that. And sometimes, like, I share that story in a seminar, people are like, oh, I bet he was lying. And two things. One is, yeah, that's my response, like, shrug my shoulders. One is, if you saw him, you could see how sincere he was. And number two, even if he was lying, like he's put on notice, I'm going to call you out on this if you do it again. I'm not going to try to discern whether he's telling the truth or not. And so having once in my first career been a therapist and working with a lot of men, stereotype time, I knew, even though I love talking about relationships and stuff, we're not going to go there with this guy. Like, because I really wanted to talk about like all the other times he's been mean to people, and that doesn't really help the working relationships, et cetera, et cetera. I knew enough not to do that, and just like, hey, appreciate your willingness to talk about it. He's like, no, man, thanks for bringing it up. He never did it again to
Wow.
me, and I never saw him do it to anybody else. And so if you were to ask me to put money on, is this conversation going to go well or crash and burn? I would put money on it's going to crash and burn. So I love sharing that story to give people hope that even people that haven't demonstrated they're capable of a mature conversation, if you do bring your A game, and all the stuff that Susan, you and I have been talking about in our LinkedIn Live, if you go in there in a productive state, telling yourself a useful story, it can work out. So
It's a
those are
great story.
oh, thanks.
And it's reminded me, actually, David, of something that is in my book, Leading Beyond the Numbers. But it's something that I have to constantly remind myself of. And it's one of these practices, isn't it, that we keep talking about as well, that we let go of sometimes. But it's to look at the person and not the behavior. Right? So it's to actually look at the person and not their behavior, because the behavior is just a manifestation. Like that person wasn't aware of their behavior, but by you looking at the person and figuring out how to deal with the person revealed themselves as well and looked at their own behavior. So I think sometimes we get caught up in the behavior, and actually there's a person behind that. And that's where bringing your curiosity, that's the phrase you use, get curious, not furious, David, right?
Yes. And you think about if I had, right after the meeting, stormed into, well, I was going to say into his office, stormed to his cubicle and confronted him, cues of threat, big time, immediately triggered a defensive and antagonistic response on his part. So for other people that have delayed intelligence like I do in those situations, it can be a good thing because you have time to pause, reflect, calm down, and come up with a curious, measured response.
And I think that calmness is important, because I was reflecting earlier today before speaking to you about the thread that is behind a lot of these examples of bad behavior, which was shared with me. And a lot of it was temper and anger. And so if you meet that anger with your own anger, you're not going to get a positive response. Whereas taking yourself out of the situation, considering how to respond, and then coming at it with exactly the approach that you talked about, David, you're more likely to get a positive outcome, because you're not meeting them where they are, you're meeting them at a different place with a bit of distance. I think that's what's really important.
Huge. And that's where I love the work of Pema Chodron, the Buddhist nun. I always recommend the book Don't Bite the Hook by her. I recommend the audio version. And it's so true when she talks about that thing that I know the three of us have talked about, is that pause, the power of the pause. And I love what she talks about. It's so true that if we do lash out of anger, it feels good in the moment because we've discharged that pent up energy. And it's like, oh, I got that off my chest. And all that does, neurons that fire together, wire together, all it does is reinforce that other people are pulling our strings and we're not able to maintain that calm.
It reminds me of some coaching conversations I've had over the years where people have come angry about something, an email that was sent or something that was said in a meeting, and they want to react, they want to respond, and I quite often ask the question, what purpose is that serving? Why are you doing that? How is that going to help? And you'll get that brief feeling of, oh, that's it, I've told them everything I want them to know, but it won't last. It won't resolve the situation. And it's just you lashing out, just like they've lashed out at you. The temptation to respond quickly, the temptation to write an email back to the snotty email you've received is huge. But it's actually about taking a pause, taking that step back and reflecting, and then coming at it with that positive story, positive mindset, as you said, David, and coming at it as from a place of wanting to try and resolve it, but also of curiosity. I think that point that you said, Susan, is really important. You've got to be curious. And I suspect for a lot of people, they do lack that self-awareness. No one's told them this before, so they don't realise the impact that it has.
I guess there's also the issue of whether the person is more senior than you at the same level or more junior, whether that's email, in person. That also adds a dynamic, if you allow it, I think, because at the end of the day, we're human beings being human, and there is a way to be treated and there's a way not to be treated, and being able to stand up for yourself, knowing what's right and what doesn't fit well with you, that's what matters too. And it's always important to be able to stand up for yourself, because otherwise you'll turn into a resentful, bitter human. And you might think that because somebody's more senior than you, that they should know better. Well, you'd be right to think they should know better, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily do. And I think we can lose sight of that as well. And I was very fortunate growing up, because my dad, the one piece of advice that I've kept with me all these years is, just because somebody's in a position of authority doesn't mean that they're right or that they know what they're doing. And I think, especially when it comes to unacceptable or poor or bad behavior, that's never right. And they shouldn't be doing it. And so you're always encouraged not to settle for that, I would say, in whatever way you can resolve the situation, do it.
And I think I would also encourage anyone listening who has got issues with this sort of behaviour or knows someone who has, to make use of the systems and processes that exist in organisations to help, because it is difficult if it's somebody more senior than you, or if it's prolonged and it's causing a lot of distress. And all organisations will have processes to deal with this sort of thing, of a variety of forms. HR departments, some organisations have counsellors and external organisations, but there's lots of support out there. And I think from my time working in HR, you see a huge amount of this sort of behaviour. And it was interesting what was said earlier about people not realising that what they're doing is offensive or causing problems for people. And that's often the case. But that's not the point. The issue from an HR perspective is always it's how something is perceived rather than what the intention was. So you do have to reach out. You do have to get that support. And the number of times I've sat there in formal meetings where the person who's been accused of doing something has said, oh, well, it was just a joke, or we were just having a bit of fun. And it's not fun if it's causing problems for somebody else.
That's
Yes,
often
like
a
that
poor
saying
excuse.
Yeah.
It is, yeah, it's just fun. They can't take a joke, blah, blah, blah. You still hear it now. And I think it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if that was your intention. If someone's upset by it, that's not okay.
And you're shirking your responsibility. Sorry, David, I'll stop now. You're not taking personal responsibility for the fact that that had an impact on another human being. Yeah, David.
It actually used the word I was going to use, impact. It's like that classic saying, the difference between intent and impact. It actually kind of reminds me of the good old back eons ago when I studied neurolinguistic programming, when one of the little quotes was, the meaning of a communication is the impact it has. And I love that. Yeah, it doesn't matter what you intended. The meaning is how it affected the person, the meaning they created. So adjust accordingly. Yeah.
So going back then to the other train of thought that you had, David, how do we make sure that we're not that person who's wandering around behaving in a way that is upsetting to people? How can we and the listeners make sure that we're not that person?
Yeah, so I'll just throw out a few thoughts and love to hear what you two think of. So one is, it reminds me of Mark Twain, the great cynic and sarcastic person, where he said, no man's life is a complete waste. He can always serve as a bad example to avoid. And so with that premise, we can learn about ourselves by watching other people. And so notice other people behaving badly and ask, do I do a version of that? And so let's say the example of the person like, hey, if it wasn't for me, this never would have happened. Like, okay, I would never be that ridiculous, but is there some other way where I try to shine the spotlight on me or discount other people so I feel better, for instance? So using other people and things that bug us as a stimulus for self-evaluation. And I think back to psychological safety, being brave enough to ask people that you respect for feedback. I love the concept of feed forward. And it's interesting. I first heard it from Marshall Goldsmith, who's like super famous executive coach, and how if he works with an executive, he won't work with them unless they get feedback from their team. But he frames it as feed forward, which instead of saying like, what have I done that's like really, horrible, I'm exaggerating. It's in the future, what can I do differently? Like that stop, keep doing, do more of conversation. The key is it's in the future. And it's so interesting. Good old Adam Grant, I think it was in Hidden Potential. Yeah, it was in Hidden Potential where he talks about that's what he recommends people instead of getting feedback is give advice. Like, how can I be a better presenter? How can I be a better listener? How can I give better constructive feedback? So it's moving forward, not analyzing the past. Because you think about it, if you analyze the past, it can trigger shame and helplessness because like, okay, I'm not good in that area. I've got all these examples of not doing well. Okay, I'm a big loser. But if it's in the future, this would make me even better. I can do something about that. So asking for candid feedback in a feed forward way. And one of the things I've said to people is, please don't worry about hurting my feelings. Like, I really want to know, because you think about it, the most sensitive and emotionally intelligent of your friends, it's very possible they're least likely to give you the really hard to hear feedback. So how to lower the bar to make it easier for them to be really candid. So some of my thoughts about that.
I think that's
How
really
about you
interesting
all?
because a lot of people are quite afraid of feedback, aren't they? 360 feedback and things. But I like that idea of the feed forward. And I was reflecting when you were talking, David, on the point you were making about saying to friends it's okay. I think this is when it's quite useful to get someone you don't really know that well to give you some feedback. So this is where having someone external supporting you is really helpful, because I remember my coach said to me when I was working with her that the benefit of having a coach is they'll have the conversations with you that your friends and family won't. So your friends and family always want the best for you. If you say, oh, how do you think I did with that presentation? They're more likely to go, oh, you were amazing, because they love you and they care for you. Whereas a coach or someone external is more likely to go, well, there's things you could have done better. So I think it's good to get some external advice on that. Dr. Jackie Rigby was on my podcast recently, and she said, you can't read the label when you're inside the jar. And that really stuck with me, because you can't see it unless someone else points it out to you, and you're more likely to get that feedback from someone else. Now, I know that's not within everyone's gift to get external support, but I certainly think for leaders, it's really important that they get some external support.
And what you said, David, about looking to the past as well, I think defensiveness is the other one that it can bring up. So I think you talked about shame or guilt, defensiveness, which also will shut down and become a barrier, and it will stop future conversations. Somebody might not notice that you feel the guilt or the shame, but they'll probably notice when you become defensive, and that will stop them coming back to you again. And the other thing that I'm recalling as we're having this conversation is I had this lady on my podcast quite some time ago now, and she talked about how she was writing another book at the time, and the book was about how not to be a jerk. And she was writing it from the perspective of having been a jerk at work. And she was very open about that. And she said she was a jerk. She was horrible to people. And she said she knew, and her theory was that most people do know when they're behaving badly or poorly or unacceptably. They just don't know how to shift out of it because they're unhappy with themselves, with their lives, with all these things that are going on. And her book is really interesting. I'll put it in the show notes. I can't remember the name of it now, but I think it might be something like How Not to Be a Jerk. If you're somebody listening to this, and we're saying, how do you make sure it's not you or us? And if you know that you don't always behave in the best way or the way you'd like to, you'll possibly get something from reading that book as well, because she draws out her own story and stories of others in a really, really helpful way. She says the book is for people who no longer want to be jerks. But I actually thought it was really interesting as well to read it from the perspective of to be more understanding of people who are unhappy with things and taking it out on others. Because it's not about us. And I think that's the other thing maybe we haven't said is this behavior that somebody has towards us is never about us. It's always about them. And that's something to remember.
Although I would like to throw another perspective, another phrase that I love from years ago about we teach people to treat us the way they treat us. And so if we tolerate the bad behavior, we're signaling that that's okay. So let's say the food throwing boss, whatever's going on inside of them is driving that behavior. And so it's a both and if we're tolerating it, they're getting the message that's okay. I want listeners to also have that back to that accountability for ourselves. Like, okay, given that reality, what's in my circle of control?
That's really helpful.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I think it is that calling it out, isn't it? Is what helps people understand whether something's acceptable or not acceptable, but also at an organizational level sets the standard for how people behave within that organization. And if people see a behavior being perpetuated, especially at a leadership level, that becomes almost the way things are done. That can't continue. I've worked in organizations where people speak to each other in the most atrocious way in meetings, but people complain about it, but nothing's ever done. And it happens even at the most senior levels. And so it carries on. So holding people accountable whilst recognizing that the behavior is because of the person who's doing it rather than anything that you have done in particular. And I think you're right, Susan. Often this behavior that we characterize as bad or inappropriate is as a result of negative emotions of the person. So whether it's unhappiness, shame, regret, all of these things, they can lead to some very negative behaviors.
Also, when you talked about being modeled in leadership, another fun fact from Robert Sutton's research that was really disturbing was he said how research shows that if you work for a jerk, you are likely to become a jerk. Isn't that terrifying that behavior you end up emulating that? I don't know if it's like, oh, I guess that's okay, or it ends up being a survival mechanism, whatever. And actually back to Adam Grant, I remember one of his LinkedIn post where it was a screenshot from a tweet that he did, something like, if you accept a job in an organization with a goal of changing the culture, forget it. The culture is going to change you.
Wow.
So, cautionary note, be really mindful of what environment we put ourselves in.
And I wonder if people become like that because they see that as the way to get on, or whether it's because that's seen as acceptable. I'm thinking of a place I worked a few years ago. There was no negative behaviour on anyone's part, but I noticed that people started dressing like the new boss quite quickly. It was interesting to see that people who previously had dressed in a certain way suddenly started to dress in a different way. And so that got me thinking, well, why were they doing that? Well, they were doing it because perhaps they thought that was the way to be successful. So I'm wondering with some of these behaviours, whether people do it because it just becomes normal, or whether they start doing it because they see that as the way to success. Don't know. I didn't start dressing. Just want to say that it was a man. I didn't want to dress like him, but others did.
I think it can come back to, if you don't know who you are, then you will follow in the footsteps of the person you think you want to be, perhaps. Again, it reminds me of a podcast conversation with Eamon Fitzgerald from quite some time ago. I used the story in my book as well, but he said when he became the managing director of an organization, he thought that he needed to be like the former managing director. And those shoes were not possible for him to fill because he was a completely different person. And when he relaxed into his job and showed up as himself, he found he was much more successful. Then this is where we come back to self-awareness or coaching or any of those things, that finding out who you are truly is so important, and understanding yourself and not perhaps wasting. I don't want to be like insulting anyone, but trying to copy someone else isn't the way to be yourself in this life. And sure, you can take things from them that you want to use and you can learn from them, but be yourself.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think a lot of that sort of modeling of behavior and dressing the same, I suspect, came from a place of inexperience and not being sure who you were. And I think, yeah, it is about having that confidence to just be you, but also having that level of self-awareness, reflection, insight, that we can check in on ourselves just to make sure we're not being the jerk, you know. Isn't it this thing that someone says, if there's no idiot in the room, you're the idiot? Well, maybe that's the way to think about it. If you're in a meeting and you don't know who the jerk is, maybe you're the jerk.
I think that's a great point, Susanne, because if you're the common denominator, often in a situation that you don't get on with this person and you don't get on with that person and you don't get on with that person and you don't like that, and you're the thing that's in common, then perhaps you need to look at yourself. And that's easier said than done. It really is. And it takes practice, but you got to start somewhere.
No one wants to be that person, do they? I mean, it's very brave of your podcast guest to write a book about how she used to be a jerk. I really admire that, because I think how many of us would actually be prepared to stand up and say, I was that person? Hats off.
Yeah. She's done so much work and internal work and turned her life around, and it's quite incredible. And that was her second book. So yeah, I'll definitely put this in the show notes.
One for the reading list.
Where do we go from here? Do we have one last story? Do we think we've done enough? Does anyone have anything else they'd like to share?
I don't have any more stories of terrible behaviour. Well, I do, but they're all quite similar to what we've already talked about. I think for me, what I've really enjoyed about this discussion is that discussion about self-awareness and having that insight and asking others for how we appear. And I think there's a benefit to all of us for doing that, both reflecting on interactions that we have with other people after we have them, but also asking other people for that feedback. And I notice in organizations there's not enough time for reflection, and I think it's really important that we build that in for ourselves and for others, so that people do have time to think about these things.
Totally. Reflection is like a superpower, and
Superpower.
it really is something that, and it took me a long time to believe that. And it's a practice. And of course, being honest in your reflection is also a practice, because it's very easy to reflect on everyone else and everything else. And starting from, what did I contribute to that situation, or what could I have done differently? And it's not about the judgment, is it? We will all beat ourselves up. We're all our own worst critics. But at times we don't recognize that we also have a power to shift something or to make a change. And that power often starts with reflection, self-reflection.
And I think maybe one other simple practice that can be helpful to people is when you're asking for feed forward, we'll say feed forward, is to make sure you ask for examples, like what would that look like, so that we know what they're talking about and not assuming just because they use a term like, be a better listener, or not be such a micromanager, whatever it is. Like, what would that look like? What would that sound like?
And also, I think maybe hold some of it lightly. Because it's not always going to be the truth. It's going to be somebody else's version of you. And of course, if it comes up time and time again, there is something to really focus in on. But we would all like people to be mirror images of ourselves so that life would just be easier.
Boy,
Yeah.
that is a huge, thank you for mentioning, that is a huge takeaway. And again, that's one of the things I really liked with Adam Grant's book, where he really dives in about how to actually make feedback useful. And kind of back to your point, Susan, or no, maybe it was Suzanne, about, friends and family, like, oh, you're wonderful and everything, is he said, like, avoid cheerleaders, and I can't remember what the other term is, but like people who are unhappy about everything in the world. Get really wise, insightful feedback givers, so you don't have to take it with a grain of salt. Be really conscious of where you're getting the feedback from. It's kind of like, Susan, that little video that we played in our LinkedIn Live. It's a comedian that Chris Williamson was talking with, where she said, we humans are projection machines. And always keep in mind that when somebody gives us feedback, it's not just a statement about us, it's a big statement about them too, and weighing that out. And then, Suzanne, it's back to where you're saying the value of having a coach to help you sort through the validity of all this feedback that you got.
Yeah, I think it is exactly that, is identifying the themes, isn't it? So if one person says something about you that you didn't know, you can think, oh, that's interesting. Then if 2 or 3 people say the same thing, then that's a theme, and that's something you really do need to pay attention to. We all have these blind spots, but it could be that it affects some people because it impacts on them and relates to their own view of the world, or because you're just very different. So yeah, I think you're right. It's that choosing feedback, listening to it, but also listening to it carefully, and trying to identify what the themes are, particularly where it's something that feels new and something that you weren't aware of about yourself.
That just reminds me of a David White, and we haven't brought David White into this conversation at all. So, but David White says, when you're starting close in, the first question to ask yourself is, what is the conversation I need to stop having in my own head? And if you ask the people around you, what is the conversation I need to stop having, they'll all tell you immediately. And he said, and they won't hold back and they'll know exactly the one. So it is great to be able to get that from people. And because our blind spots are, well, they're blind, and that's okay, because it's all about learning, growing, evolving, and being better. And as the School of Life would say, everybody wants a better life. Nobody thinks about being a better person. So we can all think about how we can be better, and then we will make our lives better. It's that simple.
Love it.
Very true.
So this has been fun. Thank you so much for those brilliant example stories, Susanne. They brought the whole thing to life, that we actually have people's real life stories and not just our own. I mean, we have plenty of stories, but it's great to have others' stories and not have any attachment to them ourselves. And I look forward to us being together again in the future.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks for listening.
Thank you for joining me today on Life Beyond the Numbers. If something in this episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you've enjoyed this conversation, please take a moment to leave a review. It helps others like us discover this podcast and join in our conversation. Until next time, keep exploring the human side of work life.